therapy bans harm, truth, and people. Welcome to Freedom Alive. We must always protect the freedom of clients to receive the counseling of their choice, and counselors the freedom to help them. Dr. Christopher Rosik has been a licensed clinical psychologist for 38 years. Dr. Rosik has helped many clients struggling with gender confusion and will share some of those stories. Yet he and other Christian counselors continue to fight challenges to stop them from helping these people. I'm thankful to again be joined by my friend and co-host, Matt Staver from Liberty Counsel. And Matt, there's a phrase some people use to push the LGBT agenda and medical mutilation narrative. Would you rather like to have a dead daughter or a live son?
Yeah, what that essentially is telling these parents that they have a son or a daughter that comes in, and they want to identify as something other than how they were born. Well, do you want to have a dead son, your actual son, or a live daughter, somebody that this person is going to, quote, transition into? It's all false, it's fake, and it's harmful and dangerous. And these counseling bans actually are designed to force that kind of ideology. The Supreme Court struck down those counseling bans. We have been litigating against these bans since 2012, and Dr. Rosik has been one of the key individuals that has been a client of ours at the very beginning when we began this litigation. So he is an expert in this field, and I can't wait to share his interview with you.
Absolutely. Such a timely issue. We cannot wait to bring it to you. But Liberty Counsel's Freedom Alert is next.
Church services have been banned for months. Liberty Counsel continues to litigate on behalf of Coastal Family Church in Flagler County, Florida, for their freedom to hold worship services. A Florida state court judge has banned attendees from gathering for Bible study, prayer, or religious worship in the church building. The lawsuit names the Honorable Sandra Upchurch in her official capacity as a judge for Flagler County. Church leaders have sought emergency relief from every available Florida state court and the Florida Supreme Court, so far without success. The church is in a strip mall and has been sued by its property association over alleged parking congestion and a condominium covenant that the association interprets as prohibiting public assembly, although secular assembly is permissible. The court cannot ban religious assembly while secular assembly is still permissible. Please pray for a resolution soon.
Up next, Matt's interview with Dr. Christopher Rosik.
Well, it's my very special honor to welcome to Freedom Alive Dr. Christopher Rosik. Dr. Rosik is a licensed clinical psychologist, has a PhD in that particular area, is one of the most articulate, well-researched, and well-read individuals in this particular area, specifically the area that we're going to be talking about today. Welcome to Freedom Alive, Dr. Rosik.
Good to see you, Matt. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, and we've known each other for many years, and in fact, you were part of that original lawsuit, one of the first lawsuits in the country, in California, when in 2012, the state of California passed a law that banned change counsel, or counseling by licensed counselors to overcome or to reduce unwanted same-sex attractions, behaviors, or gender confusion in clients. So clients could not receive that kind of counseling, and counselors were prohibited by that law from receiving that kind of counseling. And thankfully, the United States Supreme Court just recently in the Childs case ruled that those were unconstitutional in violation of the First Amendment right to freedom of speech.
I totally agree with what you're saying there. Yes, I was like the second plaintiff on that. In reality, though, it really was a law that was designed to intimidate therapists. It was never, in my knowledge, enforced. No one ever, there might have been one clinician who wasn't even a believer, I think, who was accused of this and had their license threatened. But for the most part, these laws are about intimidation and, don't do this work with clients. So that's my take on where they're coming from in this.
Well, let's talk about this issue with regards to, say, same-sex attractions. or somebody who wants to go through surgeries and drugs because they think that they're in the wrong body and they need to change their body to match their mind. Let's begin with the area of your expertise. Obviously, you're a licensed clinical counselor, psychologist, and you counsel a lot of different issues. But let's talk about this issue. What is it that you have seen in your practice or in your studies that's at the root cause of a lot of what you're seeing? And give us some background about this issue.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been in the field for almost 40 years now. And I tell people that the first 30 some of those years, I saw maybe 3 clients who were adults who had some gender questions or identified as transgender. And then in the last 8 years or so, I've probably seen like a dozen, mostly adolescents, who were claiming that they were a trans or claimed trans identity. So something really changed in the culture. And so I do think that is one ingredient in why this, at least the last 10 years or so, there's been such a increase in the prevalence of trans and non-binary and other kinds of identities, is there is a certain cultural contagion going on with that, which I think is beginning to wane a bit, but clearly that was a piece of it. There's always been a small population in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is what psychiatrists, psychologists use to diagnose. Even the latest version, the prevalence of transgender, gender identity issues was about 0.1%, right? And so that's historically, I think that has always existed, but not 3, 4, 5%, which is what we were seeing during the heyday of the trans kind of movement.
Now, in the 1970s, homosexuality, as well as the issue of what they called back then transsexual or gender identity disorder, what they call now, that was classified as a mental disorder and then changed in the 1970s to no longer be a mental disorder. And then also you had gender identity disorder, which is now gender dysphoria that they changed it to. They were both considered some kind of abnormality, a disorder. How did that change, and what was behind the change of the nomenclature in terms of what they describe as these particular issues and how they classify them?
Wow. Well, there's a lot you could say to that. I mean, one of the things that it shows, though, I think, is that the diagnostic process and defining disorders and things, there are aspects of it, especially in the sexual paraphernalia area, that are downstream from culture. So I think it was as much a response to culture as it was a response to some new scientific understanding of the conditions. Now, that said, I think there was a lot that was done as far as understanding these kind of behaviors, these kind of experiences in medical terms, which may not always have been the best way to understand them. When I meet with clients on these issues, when that happens, they're not coming to me because they have a disorder. Right? That's not why they're coming typically. They're coming because they have a moral problem. It doesn't match their faith. They believe that in terms of their faith that this is not behavior that they wish to engage in. And if possible, they want to explore the possibilities of finding, being able to shift their attractions and behaviors more in a direction that aligns with their traditional Christian faith.
Well, therein lies the problem with these laws that had been in so many different areas, over 100 of these, when you look at the cities, states, and counties where these laws proliferated. And they all began in your state of California, the litigation that you were a part of with David Pickup, another counselor. And that
You're very welcome.
yeah, it all began with your state, unfortunately. And then it went across the country, but fortunately they've been shot down. But I want to talk about what the reaction is of, say, California, maybe some of the other states after the Supreme Court decision. We'll talk about that later. But that's the issue, in counseling. Counseling has always been where the person being counseled has the self-direction, autonomy to be able to choose a counselor of his or her choice and to be able to set the objectives. They want to overcome certain things that they're dealing with, stressors in their life. But these laws prohibited very uniquely, unlike anything else, the client from receiving that kind of counsel and counselors from providing that kind of counsel. How dangerous is that within the counseling setting?
Well, I obviously, having stood up against some of these laws in various jurisdictions, I think it is a dangerous thing for the government or the state to start telling clients what goals they can pursue for their life, for their sexuality, for their aspirations, and what therapy that counselors can provide. I'm talking speech to talk therapy here. So yeah, I think that's a dangerous precedent, and we're still dealing with it.
Do you find a pattern, or at least a predominance or a frequent occurrence within, say, male homosexuality of any kind of pattern in their history when they come to you and they're struggling with, say, with same-sex attraction?
Yes. So I would want to say that there's not just one way, one kind of background that could lead to same-sex attraction. And I try to listen to clients to understand how they perceive their experience first and foremost. But having said that, sure, there are patterns that one sees. Any therapist who's done work in this area knows that there are often traumatic experiences, what we call adversive childhood experiences in the lives of these individuals. And that is, quite plausibly one factor in what may give rise to same-sex attraction or gender kind of insecurity or confusion.
Now, I know the APA task force and the APA, the American Psychological Association, has tried to discourage this kind of counseling, saying that there may be evidence, or at least anecdotal evidence, of harm by someone getting this kind of counseling. You've done a lot of research in this area, and I know you've actually written declarations that are rebutting some of the APA's allegations that, frankly, I don't think have any basis in science or research. Can you address some of those issues with regards to some of the counseling organizations versus what the science is that you understand and that you research?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. But one of the problems is that these terms, conversion therapy, sexual orientation, change efforts, they are massively underspecified in terms of how we define them. So they can encompass anything from electroshocking genitals to pure speech-based counseling to generic prayer to exorcism. So when you read the literature, you see all these different definitions or definitions that encompass a broad array of things. So there's really no way of knowing when it comes just to speech-based counseling whether that really is harming anybody. I don't really think in general that it does, but you can certainly see that when it's defined so broadly, we don't really know what people are referring to. So I think some of those aversive techniques could certainly be harmful, right? But speech-based therapy, I think when done professionally, that is not going to create any significant harm to an individual who's willingly there to explore this area of their life.
Well, it seems like the harm really could be when somebody there comes to you, they have a faith-based worldview, they're struggling with, say, these unwanted same-sex attractions or gender confusion. They need to get help, and the law says they can't get the help that they need. And in fact, if you're going to give them any kind of counsel, you have to override their will, their objective. That seems to be more harmful, these laws that have been on these books beginning in 2012 from California.
Yes, I certainly agree with what you're saying here. And it's been interesting that when I have gone to APA conferences and that's American Psychological Association and other conferences where they've talked about this conflict between sexual attraction and religious belief or religious identity in clients, that what I find is that inevitably it's resolved in terms of revising the faith or getting rid of one's faith. I've never been to a conference, secular conference, where it's been resolved in terms of the person getting stronger in their kind of traditional Christian faith and exploring the possibilities for change in the intensity of their attractions and their behavior.
I kind of liken it to a GPS, that when you get into the vehicle, you put a destination in your GPS. It navigates the different traffic and the congestion and the roadblocks that you might encounter to get you to the ultimate destination. But if there's one particular address that you plug into the GPS, and every time you plug it in, no matter where you are, what your desire is, it always takes you 180 degrees in the opposite direction. How frustrating would that be? And that's essentially what these laws are doing, or have done, is they interfere with the client-patient, doctor-patient, doctor-client relationship, and they mandate from the state, from the government, the direction and the objective that the council may take. And if it doesn't take that, then there's a punishment that's imposed. That, I think, is the most harmful thing.
Right. And again, just for your viewers, we're talking about individuals voluntarily coming to therapy, self-determined goals. We're not talking about any kind of coercion. That's not therapy. That's not counseling in my book, professionally. And it's often accused of, described as being coercive, but that's not what we're talking about here. The other thing I might want to mention to your audience, a point that I like to make, is that in terms of the research, almost all of it is done with LGBT identified individuals when they study who have had or attempted change in some form or another in their past. And the problem with that is that an LGBT identified person, by definition, is someone who has probably failed or not been able to experience change for whatever reason. And those who may have done that, or who are living a non-LGBT identified life, who may experience some same-sex attraction at one point in their life, are not in any of these studies. So the analogy I like to say is that this is like evaluating the benefits and harms of marital therapy by only using participants recruited through divorce support groups, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And, those individuals, they're self-selected, so it's not randomized studies. So people, like, your analogy, I think, is good. If you wanted to look at the success of marriage, but the only people in your research dynamics and parameters are people who have bad marriages and they're divorced, you're going to get a skewed view of what marriage is really like. Same thing here.
That's right. That's right.
Now, you've counseled a lot of people. You've certainly done a lot of research in this area. Do you have any success stories? What is it that you see happening within your counseling practice? I know the very fact that somebody can change, they can overcome these, really is a denial of this whole LGBTQ agenda. And that's why I think there's such an effort from this agenda, those people who are promoting it, to say that it is impossible to change, because if you can change, that kind of cuts against their narrative. What kind of things have you seen in your practice and also in your research?
Yeah, well, obviously I can't speak to individuals. I can't talk about case material directly, but I can tell you that, it's an area that is challenging. Not everyone experiences change, but many do. And when I talk about change, it's really important to think about, I think about an experience with people, change that I define as on a continuum of change, not necessarily going from, only having same-sex attractions to only having opposite-sex attractions, right? Usually it's shifting on a continuum of change over time, because they're maybe looking at and exploring issues in their background and in their life. But what's important to remember is that, even shifts in sexuality for these people can make the difference between staying in a marriage, functioning more effectively with their heterosexual spouse. And sexuality is experienced, differently between men and women. Typically, these are men who are often coming into therapy. There's more, I'd say, fluidity with women than with men, but that doesn't mean that men don't experience shifting and change on a continuum of change.
What kind of counsel would you give to, say, parents in terms of they have a child or maybe a grandchild that's experiencing these unwanted attractions, behaviors that they have that they don't want to engage in, or they're gender confused in terms of how God made them or who they are?
Yeah, that's really important. And there's a lot of research on the importance of when a child, a minor, begins to share with the parent, that's a real pivotal, critical point in the life of that child, which can, put them on a certain trajectory, either towards the family or towards the parents, or sort of against them and into a alternative identity. So I would really encourage parents to, when they hear this news, perhaps to adopt an attitude of curiosity and concern, and not of criticism or contempt. You can frame your concerns as coming from a place of care for the child's well-being. I'd encourage parents to ask open-ended questions, to generally listen much more than you speak, especially in the beginning. And you can affirm the child without necessarily emphasizing gender issues or talking about, sexual attractions. I would want to say promote your youth's sense of belongingness, right? In their family and their faith community, building relationships, give them opportunities for that. And obviously, I think you want to provide for your child the best model you can of other identities, right? You want to be a good mother, a good father, a good man, a good woman, a good Christian, right? A good parent. So too often in my experience, the minors just do not have healthy role models for these kinds of identities. So those are really all important things they can do. And educate yourself in the area if you want. There are organizations out there that can help with this. I myself have connection to an organization called the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity. There's the American College of Pediatricians, and in terms of trans issues, the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine does a lot of good work in looking at and evaluating research articles. So there's lots of resources out there for the discerning parent.
We talked about how we got to meet each other with the litigation that Liberty Counsel did. David Pickup, you and others, challenging California's very first in the nation law that banned counselors from giving this kind of counsel and clients from receiving this kind of counsel to overcome or eliminate unwanted same-sex attractions, behaviors, and gender confusion. Then those laws proliferated across the country. And Liberty Counsel was the first in the country to win at the Court of Appeals, but now we have a United States Supreme Court decision, Childs versus Salazar, coming out of California, that struck down these identical laws. So that affects all these laws across the nation. But in response, you've got places like California and others that are trying to still impose restrictions on counselors and clients. And you've got a bill, just as an example, and there may be others that will come up, SB 934, that is percolating in the state of California. Tell us about what that bill is designed to do.
But essentially, you've got two ways to sort of come at therapists in this field. One is what the earlier approach was, which was regulation, and try to get them in trouble through regulation and licensure and that sort of thing. But the other is through basically legal action and liability. And so what SB 934 does, it extends the limitations, statute of limitations for initiating legal action against a licensed mental health provider up to 22 years for a client who supposedly was exposed to harm when they were a minor, or up to 10 years for an adult. So this covers both adults and minors, which the earlier bills that were I think undermined by Child's decision, those just covered minors. Yeah, so fundamentally, the law would be an incentive to sue, as well as a constant threat held over the heads of counselors who are willing to work with clients that wish to explore, their potential for change in sexual attractions and behavior and gender feelings. So
the first law that came out of California and that spread across the country was basically a state or government down regulation to say you can't do this kind of counseling. And if you do, then your license could be in jeopardy. But we'll have to continue to fight this. And Dr. Rosik, I appreciate your writing, your research, and your stand for principle, and particularly for your clients, since this began, many years ago in 2012.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me on, Matt. I hope it's been helpful to your viewers, and look forward to further co-laboring.
Well, Dr. Rosik, thank you for joining us. Again, Dr. Rosik is a licensed clinical psychologist and one of the experts in this critically important field. If you need more information, you can go to Liberty Counsel's website as well. We have information that can get you in touch with Dr. Rosik and others, lc.org. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Rosik, on Freedom Alive.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Matt, at Liberty Counsel, you have been on the front line of this issue, fighting back and winning, really. In your view, what is the opposite side, the other team? What drives their zeal to want to stop these counselors from helping people?
They originally wanted to argue that this was genetic. Then they moved from that to gender fluidity, that there's a spectrum and you constantly change. But anything that suggests that you can go to a counselor and that you can overcome this threatens their narrative. And so they want to stop it and literally trap people in the chains of their unwanted desires, attractions, or confusion that frankly can be deadly. At no time should the government enter into the private counseling room between a counselor and a client and tell them what they can or cannot say or what they can or cannot hear.
Amen. We hope this information encourages you, helps answer questions in your mind. Be encouraged, be heartened. With Christ, all things are possible. It's our delight to bring this information to you. In closing, remember Proverbs 11, verse 14, which says, "Where there is no guidance, a people falls, but in an abundance of counselors, there is safety." Our freedom is a gift from our Creator. We must never forget that and always protect it. Join us here next time. You'll hear victories as well as ways you can stand up for your priceless freedom. Join us again for Freedom Alive.